Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family, talk about adoption and foster care. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am the host of this show as well as the director of the nonprofit creatingafamily.org. Today, we're going to be talking about helping our kids regulate big emotions. We will be talking with Dr. Stuart Shanker. He is a distinguished research professor emeritus of philosophy and psychology at York University. He is the founder of the Emeritus Center and author of several books, including Self-Regulate, How to Help Your Child and You Break the Stress Cycle and Successfully Engage with Life, and a new book, Reframed, Self-Reg for a Just Society. He was also the former president of the Council of Early Child Development. Welcome, Dr. Shanker, to Creating a Family.
Thank you. It is lovely to be here, Dawn.
Well, you specialize in self-regulation, and that is a great topic for us because a lot of our kids struggle with self-regulation for a host of reasons. Some have experienced abuse and neglect in their earlier life. Many of them have experienced significant loss, and a substantial portion have also experienced prenatal substance exposure, alcohol and drug exposure in utero. So self-regulation is something or regulation, or the need for self-regulation is something that we know a lot about. So I'm looking forward to this. You talk about three basic principles to self-regulation, and I think that would be a good grounding for us to begin this with. Can you tell us what those three principles are, and then we'll talk about them for just a bit?
So let me start off by telling all of you that I think one of the reasons why I was invited to do this show is because both of my kids are adopted. Both of my kids had exactly the kinds of problems that we are talking about today. So for me, this wasn't simply a scientific activity. This was real. I lived it day to day. And I realized even before my children were born that there is no such thing as a bad, lazy, or stupid kid. That's principle number one.
Amen.
Why do we say that? Other than, we hope that's the case. Well, what Dawn didn't mention is I ran a neuroscience lab for many years, and it was kind of unique. On one half of the lab, we had a team of therapists, and we worked with children that were on the spectrum primarily, children that were having a great deal of trouble self-regulating or being regulated. And on the other half, we had our neuro lab, and there we could study what was going on in the brain when they were hyper-aroused, meaning dysregulated, and the effects of intervention, the effects of working on self-regulation. That's what we did for a living. There has been the most extraordinary revolution in neuroscience over the last 20 years. We are only in the very early stages of explaining the significance of all this to mom and dad, but it's huge. And so one of the things that we've learned is, to put it simply, this is just a tiny little brain, and it's just starting to form its connections. And for kids that have experienced some sort of, let's say, trauma, where trauma is not just something physical or social, but trauma could also be chemical. Like things that happened in utero, those are traumatic for a developing brain. And this does the following to a developing brain. What it does is it makes it very sensitive, hypersensitive to certain kinds of stress. All of your kids are easily overstressed. That's a kind of funny thing to say because, I'm talking about babies, infants, toddlers. How can they get overstressed? The answer is the scientific definition of stress. And that is anything that requires the brain to burn energy to stay in this sort of sweet spot, to stay in its functional range. So for a baby, the biggest stress of all for a baby, for a newborn, is light. Light is a stress. Why do we say that light is a stress? Well, the baby has been in a very dark place for 9 months. And when they're exposed, what they're exposed to, in Spanish, you say dar la luz, which is a wonderful way of explaining that you're suddenly exposed to all this light. Light is energy, light is photons, and they're bombarding the nervous system. So the brain responds, and it's got to create some neurochemicals, adrenaline basically, so that it can handle the light, so that it doesn't break down. So the baby starts producing adrenaline. Adrenaline burns energy. So the baby's producing adrenaline because of the light or because of the sound. Sound is also a stress. Or because of the cold temperature. They're used to a nice warm environment, and now they're exposed to cold air. Or someone that's rubbing them with a towel or pricking them in the heel. All of these are stresses. All of these require this little tiny brain to burn energy. Now, for a child has had some sort of a trauma in utero, these are even bigger stresses. These are even more expensive. They require more energy. And so what we find with little guys is if they've had some sort of stress even before they were born, it changes the threshold for how much energy they're going to burn. Our kids burn a lot of energy. Our kids burn more than typical kids, neurotypical circle.
Is that why we often will tell parents, one of the first things when you see your child struggling with behavior is you kind of go through a mental checklist and say, when's the last time they've eaten? When's the last time they had some water or something to drink? Because of that they're actually burning so much more, and we have to be cognizant of that.
I just love what you just said. So there's two things to what Dawn just said there that we have to unpack. The first is she just told all of you, you got to reframe your kid's behavior. So what that means is you got to ask yourself, why and why now? I'll give you a real simple example. So my older boy has autism. My older boy would have a fit every time we went to the supermarket. Shopping with him when he was an infant and a toddler, it was tough.
Been there, done that, understand.
Okay, so here's your kid. Everybody else is shopping. You're getting mean looks. Why can't you control your kid?
Yeah.
But we're going to reframe. And the supermarket is it's a scientific lab on how to stress us. I mean that literally. They've actually studied how to create stresses because it drives sales higher. Okay, so here's my little guy. And he's stressed by the sound of, all these people or the wheels on the floor, or he's stressed by the cold air that's coming, or all of these stresses are overloading his nervous system. Okay, so that's the first point. So the first point that Dawn made was you got to reframe his behavior. He's not being a bad kid. He's overstressed. It's a stress reaction. Now, the second point she made was, okay, so now you're going to go through your what she called a mental checklist. Did he sleep? Did he eat? And we're going to do all those things when my kid's having a tough time. But what about when I'm in the supermarket and I know that the stresses that my kid is under are, I've got to get through this. I need my food. I need my weekly food.
Yeah, and I've got things to do, and somehow this is the only time I have, or whatever. Yes, that's
exactly.
Life.
And I know that he's eaten. I know he's slept. I also know because I heard this scientist from Canada saying, well, there's all these stresses that I don't think of because they don't really affect me. I'm not really overstressed by the cold or whatever. What am I supposed to do now? Now, Dawn, do I have your permission to do one tiny little bit of neuroscience?
Sure. Go for it.
Okay. So this is one of the discoveries we've made literally within the last couple of years. I said to you a few minutes ago that a stress is anything that requires the kid to burn energy to stay regulated. That's what stress is. Where does the energy come from? Well, he's got that energy stored away in his organs, in his bloodstream, and in his fat cells. It's stored waiting to be used, but to use it, the brain unleashes a neurochemical wave. And this is what we call the stress response. Its function is to give the kid all of the energy that he needs to convert it into usable energy. Okay, so these neurons, these brain cells, they're in a tiny little system, in an even smaller little system, in the very middle of the brain. Okay, here's my kid now. There's a lot of stress going on. He's pumping out adrenaline to cope with all the stress. I'm seeing all the behavior problems that happen as a result. But the brain has another secret. In that same little system, the same little system inside the heart of the brain, are another group of neurons. They're nestled together, and they turn off the stress response. They turn off the adrenaline. They are called oxytocin. So Dawn is nodding because she knows all about oxytocin. We know it as the cuddle chemical. But now we know that the first function is to turn off the adrenaline, turn off the stress response. And so that introduces a really interesting question. Okay, so here I am. I'm in the supermarket. My kid's having a meltdown. And I'm saying to myself, oh, geez, I know he's stressed and I know he needs some oxytocin. And I don't think they sell oxytocin in aisle 16. So how am I going to give him oxytocin? And this is one of the secrets of the brain. We have little receptors in our skin, in our ears, receptors that when they are stimulated, trigger oxytocin. We trigger this by gently holding our child, gently stroking our child, talking to our child in a soft voice. All of these things trigger oxytocin. They turn off the stress response. Now, I'll give you a great example. A couple of nights ago, my older boy, who is now 21, was incredibly stressed when he came home. He's working now. He had some hard things happen at work. People said mean things because he's autistic. Autistics have a little trouble, monitoring what they say. And what I said to him was, now, how do you trigger oxytocin? All he needed from me was oxytocin. He didn't need a lecture. He didn't need me to tell him, well, that's life, or he needed me to give him oxytocin. He needed a hug. But the thing is, 21-year-olds don't like to be hugged.
Especially by their dad sometimes.
Especially by their dad. So I said to him when I saw him, I said, sweetheart, I have had a real tough day. I know you had a hard day, but I had an even worse day, and I could really use a hug right now. And I could feel the tension in his muscles start to relax. I could feel the adrenaline that had been triggered turn off. Then we could have a conversation. Now that he's come back to calm, now we can talk a little bit about, how we can avoid these things in the future or how we can handle it now, but not in the middle. Not when my child is having a meltdown in the middle of the supermarket. The worst thing I can do is to yell at my kid. The worst thing I can do is to say, it's only 5 more minutes and then we'll go do such and such. My kid in this state can't process anything that I'm saying. That part of their brain is shut down. Mm-hmm. What my child needs from me is what they needed when they were 6 months old. They need me to soothe their nervous system. And the miracle is I can do that just with my voice. We now know, one of the other discoveries we now made is that the voice, that speaking is also a form of touch. That the sound waves coming out of our voice, they soothe They trigger oxytocin in the eardrum, provided we speak softly, gently. So in order to do that, I have to be calm. In order for my voice to have this calming effect, in order for my hug or whatever to have this calming effect, I have to be calm myself. So when Dawn talked at the very start about self-regulation, this is point number 3. The self-regulation starts with us being calm. If I'm calm, I am able to trigger oxytocin in my kid. Okay.
Yeah, self-regulation goes both ways. We often think of we're trying to help our kids self-regulate, but in the heat of the moment, you are so right. We feel our stress and our adrenaline rising too.
Yes.
Because we're frustrated. This wasn't in our plans. This is not, we don't have time for this, whatever, the things that we go through in our heads. And also fear. Sometimes we're just, kid it's just, will this kid ever stop this? This type of thing. And that's all of those things.
Fear,
massive
anger,
stresses. Yes.
Anxiety.
Yes.
Now, here's another aspect of this. You just tweaked my memory. It works both ways, you said, and you're absolutely right, because one of the other discoveries we found is when we turn off our kids' stress response, we get the same oxytocin. We get a burst ourselves. So,
especially if it works, if we see that our child is we're lowering our voice, we're giving them something to eat, we're getting them some water, and all of a sudden we see them calm down, it calms us down. You're right.
Yeah. So the more we learn about the brain, the more we learn that there really isn't such a thing as a bad kid. What's happening is it's an overstressed kid. And the better we understand why my child is overstressed, and every kid is different. I'll tell parents 2 things here. 1, every kid is different. So what is a stress for your kid may not be a stress for anybody else. And 2, the little bugger changes on you all the time.
Yeah, I know. Dadgummit. Just when you figure it out.
Yeah, just when you figured it out. That's right.
Although there are some constants.
Yes.
Let me pause here to tell you about some free courses we have on our website to help strengthen your family. These courses are supported by the Jockey Being Family Foundation. You can find them at bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/JBF support. And you can choose from a library of courses. You can get credit if you need credit for continuing ed. However, even if you don't, they're just good for increasing your ability to be a great parent to your child. Be sure to tell your friends about them as well. We had talked about the 3 principles. The other 2, I'm going to just say the second one because I really want to focus some on the third one. The second one is that all people can learn to self-regulate. But the third one is that, and I think this is important, there is no such thing as a fixed outcome. Because I think that oftentimes, especially, well, regardless of what age the child is when they come into our home, but I think especially when the child is past infancy, it's easy to fall into that thinking that this is the way they are. This is because of all the stuff that happens. Anything I do is not going to change this child. So it's a matter of just kind of getting through. So I really like that third principle, is that there's not a fait accompli here when a child enters our home.
So we would have parents come into clinic on the first day and say to us precisely what Dawn just said, that, they had given up hope. And they felt that even if I was right, that this behavior is now so entrenched. So a big one would be anger. I won't go into the neuroscience of why this child has an anger response. It's always mixed with fear. But let's just say that patterns do become more and more entrenched. And by the time they're 10 years old, those patterns are very entrenched. And in psychology, we use a tool, it's called a personality index. And the idea is that by the age of 10, you're never going to change this pattern. And what we found was over and over, there's no age at which you can't change a pattern. Now, how do you do it? That's what everybody wants to know.
Exactly. That $64 million question.
So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to reframe our kids' behavior. Now, we know that our kid is going from 0 to 60, in a split second. They're having that anger response, or they're having that fear response, or just a general meltdown. And so our second step is we're going to figure out what the stresses are. We're going to become a stress detective. Now, I'm going to tell your parents something that's really, really important. When you look at stresses, some of them are obvious. Okay, so you've taken your kid to the supermarket. Well, that's obvious. That's clearly the stress, and you can figure it out. But some of the stresses that our kids go through are hidden. And what we mean by that is that in the moment, it doesn't seem like this couldn't be a stress. A hidden stress is one which triggers adrenaline several hours later. So let me give you a great example. I went through a phase. I'd come back to Canada from England, and I'd become a prof, and I was finding it a little stressful. And I discovered butter brickle ice cream. And it
sounds great, actually.
It was real good. And it started off, I'd have just like a quarter of a teaspoon, and it was really soothing. And pretty soon, by the end of the month, I was up to a bucket. So that became my ritual. And I was having an awful lot of trouble sleeping. I'd fall asleep really well, and then wake up at 1, 2 in the morning, and then have trouble getting back to sleep. So I have to be careful how I describe myself here. I was going to say the doofus.
Nope, there's no such thing as a doofus.
Yeah.
A doofus adult either.
So I thought, okay, so I'm having trouble. And I was working at this time with a bunch of psychiatrists in a sleep clinic. So I said, you guys got to give me something. And I thought it was the stress of, being a prof and setting up a lab. And so, I'd come home, I'd have my ice cream, and then I'd pop a Zopiclone to keep myself sleeping. And then I wake up in the morning and I was all dozy from the Zopiclone. So something wasn't working. So here's the thing. That ice cream, that bowl of ice cream, what it was doing was, I don't want to be too technical, but we have another neurochemical that wakes us up. It's called orexin. And what the ice cream does is, the sugar, it turns off those neurons. That's why we get drowsy. That's why it helps us fall asleep. But the problem is that sugar is actually a toxin. It's actually a poison for us. If we have too much sugar in the bloodstream, it can cause all kinds of cellular damage. So we got to get rid of the sugar. And we have to break it down. We have to break down the glucose. And everybody, Dawn knows exactly what I'm talking about here. We're going to produce insulin. So what happens is the ice cream made me drowsy. And then my brain goes to work to make the glucose safe for me, to break it down into little molecules. And it does that in the liver and in the pancreas. So while I'm sleeping, my brain and my organs are working like crazy. And in the middle of the night, to get rid of it all, it releases adrenaline. It releases 2 neurochemicals that are basically adrenaline. That's why I was waking up. So here I was doing something that didn't seem like it was a stress. It was helping me go to sleep. It was a hidden stress. And the same is true for our kids. We can give them, say, a soft drink, or we can give them a sweet at night, and it helps them fall asleep. And then I find that around 1 o'clock, I'm up trying to get my child back to sleep. In our case, both of our kids had a great deal of trouble falling asleep, and there are biological reasons for that. And they had a great deal of trouble staying asleep. It took a lot of patience for them both to become, and they are great sleepers. And if you go back to the very first thing that Dawn said, they need sleep. And we know if they're underslept, that they're going to have behavior issues or emotional issues. So Again, if they're having sleep problems, if your kid is having problems falling asleep, this is because of the stress load. The stress is built up. There's too much adrenaline in their system. Mm-hmm. If we do something like let them play a video game to make them drowsy just before they fall asleep, we will pay the price 3 or 4 hours later. That's what we mean by hidden stresses, things that cause that adrenaline burst several hours afterwards. And we can figure all these out. We can figure out what's a hidden stress for my kid.
What are some typical ones? You just mentioned food.
Video games.
Video games. Yeah.
Yeah. Screen time. Screen time's a big one for our kids.
Yeah. Exposure to the blue light.
Exposure to the blue light. So then the question is, so I ran this clinic for a decade. I never had a kid that wasn't addicted in one way or another to screen time. And so that raised a real interesting question for us, why? And so any parent who's listening, if you want to figure out, look, it's not that the activity itself is bad. A little's not going to hurt. It's when the kid won't get off and you have to really force them off. And then you ask yourself, how is my kid when I force them to get off? Were they nice, sweet, calm, compliant? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. So if you had a nightmare getting them to turn it off, it tells you there's something going on in the brain. So I'll tell you real fast what it is. Our kids, all of our kids, are what's called hypodopaminergic. And what that means is they don't have enough dopamine. And they need dopamine, which is another neurochemical. They need dopamine to feel positive in life, to be motivated, to go to do things, to want to learn. So why are our kids, and I'm pretty comfortable saying this, why are all of our kids at risk of being hypodopaminergic, not having enough dopamine? Mm-hmm. And the reason is because stress shuts down, inhibits dopamine neurons. If they have too much stress, go back to where we started, they won't have enough dopamine. And the games, the screen time, they are geniuses at what's called dopamine hijacking, how to trigger dopamine. And they do it with lights and colors and noise. We live in a world of dopamine hijacking. And it is studied. The guys who designed these games studied psychology research from the 1970s telling you how to trigger dopamine, literally. Mm-hmm. So what our kid is doing, our hypodopaminergic kid is doing, is they're going to the screen time to get that shot of dopamine because they want dopamine. They need dopamine.
Mm-hmm. It feels good.
It feels good. But the problem is dopamine does not shut down the stress response. Remember where we started today. Dopamine, we've got this adrenaline that's pumping. Dopamine doesn't do anything for that. So the question then is, how do we shut down the stress response? Well, we've already answered that. We do it with oxytocin. When my kid comes home, point of the story that I told you a couple of minutes ago, when my 21-year-old came home, but whatever their age, when our kids are overstressed, they need more than anything us. Mm-hmm. They need us to help them become calm. Now, there are other ways they can get oxytocin. They can get oxytocin from music, from reading, from cooking, from art. There's all these, being in nature, all of these things have been shown to trigger oxytocin. These are all really important habits to cultivate. But number one is us. We are the primary trigger of oxytocin in our kids. So if I see my kid come home and he makes a beeline to go play a game that I know is going to make him even more stressed, right? Because I'm always asking why and why now. I'm asking myself now, okay, my kid's had a real stressful day. So school is very stressful for our kids for lots of reasons, right? They have to sit still. They're surrounded by kids. It's a stressful time. It stresses. And if they've come home and they're in that stress state and I learn how to recognize the stresses By the way, I'm still answering your question for a couple minutes ago. How are we going to break this cycle?
Mm-hmm.
And I see that they're overstressed. So now what I'm going to do is to turn off the stress response. That's step 3 of this process. So I'm going to figure out what are the things that I can do with my kid. Is it take a walk? Is it do some cooking? Is it just chatting? Whatever it is. Somehow with my kids when they were young, I used to have that whisk that, you put on the head. That would calm them down right away.
Mm-hmm. For one of mine, it was a warm bath by himself with bubbles and
Awesome.
toys.
I did that one too. I love it, especially when they were young.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I'd put a snack sitting beside the tub and just, set up the baby monitor so that I would know he was okay. And in 30 minutes, he would be looking like a prune, but it worked phenomenally for him.
Okay, so Dawn just defined step 3, which is reducing the stress response.
I want to thank a very long-time supporter of this show, and that is Children's Connection, Inc. Children's Connection, Inc. is a adoption agency as well as a child welfare agency in Texas, and they place children for domestic adoption, and they do home studies for all types of adoption. And the home studies are done in Texas. The placing of children for adoption is done throughout the U.S. They also have a lot of other services that they provide to families in Texas to help stabilize and support families. Thank you so much for your long support of this show. Let me stop here and just remind everybody, step 1 for managing stress is reframing the behavior.
Yep.
Understanding the difference between a kid being bad, misbehaving, and a stress behavior, and noticing that. So reframing it in your head, the why and why now. The second one is recognizing stressors, and there's some obvious ones we know: hunger, thirst, too much noise, too much, a chaotic environment, having somebody say something mean to them, or not being able to stack the Legos the way they want. Those are obvious ones.
Good one.
But then there are some hidden ones that you don't think of because the stress event or the impact of it is delayed, and that can be food, it could be video games, it could be any other, and it's probably some emotional ones too that come out. And then the third one is one we're talking about now is how do we reduce the stress? Go ahead. Now you can talk about the third one.
No, you just did a great job. So the third one is what we've been talking about, and we're going to do it, Dawn's bath. That's a great one. So what we're reducing here, we're going to not just reduce have it nice and quiet. We want that bathroom to be, that soothing environment. I love the bubbles, which is giving that kid, the soothing tactile sensations. But what we're really trying to do is stop the adrenaline, reduce the stress response so that step 4, our kid feels calm. Now, calmness is a very interesting thing. We have a generation, not just children, not just teens, all ages, but we have a generation of kids who don't know what calmness is, don't know what calmness feels like. Calmness is different from being quiet. When a child is calm, they get another neurochemical called an endorphin. And we get endorphins from all kinds of things. We get endorphins from exercise. We get endorphins from food. We get endorphins from being hugged. Or I had to be very careful because of my 2 boys, my younger one didn't really like hugs, was tactile sensitive. But with him, it was just a case of being close, quiet, my presence. That's what he wanted, not touch per se. So we figure out, and with my older one, I had to figure out what kind of touch. He liked to be scratched. He was a scratch kid, so I would scratch away. Okay. The point is that we want our child to experience calm, endorphins, and be aware.
Yeah, that's the interesting part. It's not that when they calm down, but the thing that I thought was interesting reading this was It's their awareness of what that feels like.
Yes.
How do we help them become aware, though? So your child, you hug your child, or you scratch them, or you put them in the bathtub, or whatever. How do we help them recognize the difference between how they're feeling before they got in the bathtub and soaked and played and was quiet for a while, and when they got out?
So bear in mind that, we're doing this. You mentioned, these are your kids are young when you were doing this. So a little kid has a very limited ability to process words, even the word, like calm. We know what it means, but why would a 3-year-old know what that means? But there are ways of explaining this to a child at a level that they can process. So, for example, with the kids in clinic, we would use, our therapists were working on exactly this, and they would use 2 dolls. They had a Buzz Lightyear doll and a Raggedy Ann doll. And they would say to them, "Do you feel like Buzz?" All stiff, and then they would do some massage or whatever they were doing, and then say, "Do you feel like Raggedy Ann yet?" And sometimes they would take pasta and they would have cooked pasta and uncooked pasta. Do you feel, but the point was to give them associations that they could resonate with at their level, whatever. And we found that we could get 3-year-old children on the spectrum to know what calmness felt like, and to know that the first 3 steps that Dawn and I have just done were the steps they had to do to get to calm, to get to step 4. So to break a cycle, you don't break a cycle today. You don't say, well, I heard this great lecture. It was all about self-regulation. So I'm going to do, oh my goodness, it didn't work. I did everything. So this takes time, and we do it. Okay. So this is I spent too many years working in South America, so forgive me, but we do it paulatinamente, slowly, step by step. And what happens is, to break a cycle, maybe it's going to take you months, bearing in mind that the child is constantly going to go through transitional stages where they are exposed to a whole new set of stresses. The stresses of when they are 6 years old, the stresses of going to school for the first time, whole new set of stresses. The stresses of when they graduate, when they transition from public school to middle school, or from middle school to high school. There are or when they, or here's one for every parent listening, when they go through puberty. That's a lot of fun for us.
And it's equally not as much fun for them. I mean, there are things that are very fun about it, but there's, think back to your own adolescence, and you can remember that just not understanding both the physical things but also the emotional things.
And the emotional, and so we know that they are going to go through periods of suddenly intensified stress, and it's not unusual to see them regress to earlier behavior patterns when this happens. So we realize to change a cycle, it may take a lifetime. But, okay, so I am still learning, and I'm 70 and I'm still learning stuff about myself every day. But what's happening is, what we find is that as they master these first 4 steps, we'll get to the 5th step in 1 second. You'll notice that when they do become dysregulated, when they do have this sudden breakdown, they return to calm much more quickly. They can recalibrate faster. So what's happening is the brain now, the channels that produce these endorphins, they're getting carved. As you're doing this day after day, they're getting more and more of a direct pathway to endorphins. So this is not to say that if I do this, my kid is never going to be dysregulated again. It is to say 2 things. First, that when they have these moments of dysregulation, they're going to know what to do. One of the wonderful things about being aware of calm is, because you're getting all these endorphins, It feels really good. It feels better than the dopamine fix. Calmness, we all love that feeling, including a little guy. So that's the first point. The second point is, even when you think, so, we'd be working with parents and they'd say, I've been doing this now, it's 3 months and we're not getting anywhere. But in fact, you are. And you don't notice it because of something Dawn said at the start. We get so anxious when our kid is anxious. And there is connection, a brain to brain connection between them and us. It's called the interbrain. We don't just see that our child is upset. We feel that our child is upset. We have the same neurons that are vibrating like crazy in my kids start to vibrate in me. I am in the same kind of state. However, because I've learned how to do self-reg for myself, I can take that deep breath. I can bring myself back down. I can lend my calm to my child. Calm begets calm. And you will notice, you may think you haven't been making progress, but you have.
I like that. Calm begets calm. That's so true.
Well, we go a step further. So calm begets calm and stress begets stress. And what that means is that my kid, I mentioned that little part of the brain that deals with stress, and it releases a chemical called corticotropin releasing factor. And when my kid's brain releases that, I get a shot of CRF. I get a shot of the same stress hormone. However, because I've studied self-reg and I've learned of its benefit, I can turn it off instantly. And now I can turn off my kids' calm, my kids' distress. I can turn off my kids' CRF.
What are some techniques you use to reduce your stress? You recognize it first, recognizing that you are getting hyped up and stressed, and that stress begets stress. I like that. How do you reduce your stress load?
There's a story in that 2016 book you mentioned called Self-Reg. It's a great story. So we had a mom come see us. And so she had a wonderful relationship with her child, with her daughter, until her daughter hit puberty. Now, this kid had been a real active gymnast, and she was good. And when she hit puberty, she stopped gymnastics cold turkey. Now, the gymnastics had been very regulating for her. Remember, exercise produces endorphins. So why did she quit? Well, because she'd gotten teased. She'd gotten teased by the non-gymnastic girls for having big muscles. And anyway, she became self-conscious, all that stuff. The problem was, by stopping cold turkey, she had stopped what had been her primary form of self-regulating growing as an older child. And the two of them started to have these nightly fights, and they had never fought. And the fights would go on for hours, and it would end up, and it was every night, and it would end up with the kids screaming, "I hate you. I never want to see you again.
You're the worst mother in the world.
Exactly.
If my real mother would love me more, would let me do this." Yep.
And trust me, I've had that one, and it goes right to the heart. Okay. So we said to Mom, okay, now what we want you to do. So this was a mom who, as it happens, did yoga every day. So he said, okay, so what we want you to do, we don't want to go into this cycle at all. So the next time it happens, what we want you to do is just take a moment. The fights are always happening in the kids' bedrooms. So go out into the hall, do some deep breathing, calm yourself down. Okay. The kid had asked, all the girls were wearing pink hoodies. So the kid had asked Mom if she could pick up a pink hoodie. Mom had gone at her lunch hour during work. They were all out of pink hoodies. They only had gray ones left. So Mom bought the gray one.
Oh, so fatal mistake. I could have told
fatal
that.
Mistake.
Rookie mistake.
Okay. So there's an explosion that night. And then mom gets really upset because she's given up her lunch,
Sure.
but the doctor said, I'm not allowed to. Okay. The doctor said, I can't say anything. So she goes out into the hall and she does her deep breathing, calms herself down, and comes back into the room, and she turns off the light because, what we want to do is reduce stresses that we can. Light is a stress. The kid is lying hunched up on her bed. Now, what we want to do is we want to trigger the oxytocin in the kid, just like I did with my son. You can't pull off the trick about, well, I had a hard day, can I have a hug? And you're not going to get it if you ask for it. And one of the problems that you have when your child, so here we're dealing with a 13-year-old, but when they've gone into this state, the part of the brain that processes language is really constricted. So if you ask them things, they can't answer. They're not processing what you're saying. And what we want to do is we want to establish physical contact. We want permission to stroke her arm. This was a kid who liked being stroked. But if there's no language, how do you communicate with your child when they're overwrought? And so one of the things we've learned is the language gets all bottled up, but nonverbal communication doesn't. Right brain stays online. So you say to your kid, so in this case, she said to the kid, would you like me to massage? Now, you can say to the kid, raise your finger if you'd like that. Or the best one is if you put your finger inside their hand and say, would you like me to massage your shoulders, squeeze my finger? And that's what she did. And so she gets the little squeeze back.
Probably with a harumph, just because why not? You're dealing with a teen. Harumph.
But now think for a second, right? You've just established physical contact, which is what you want. And you've been given permission. So she starts to rub and scratch. And there are certain parts of the body that are safe, and you learn which they are. But basically, the forearm is safe and the shoulder is safe. And she can feel, as I described with my son, she can feel the muscles relaxing. And the doctor had said to her, you're not allowed to say anything. Keep your mouth shut. If you have to say something, the only thing you're allowed to say is, I love you. We really want this to be a brain-to-brain connection. Okay. So she's doing this, and the kid starts to melt on the bed. And after 15 minutes, the kid's ready to go to sleep. And she says, the last thing she says is, I love you, Mommy. Now that's pretty significant, because what's happened in this child is she has regressed to infancy. She has been in a state, she's overstressed, and she needs her mommy without feeling that you're not being, a teen or whatever. She needs her mommy to turn off the stress, to make her feel safe and secure, as she had when she was a baby. Okay, so mom leaves the room, and the kid's ready to sleep now, and there's been no fight. And mom's thinking, now mom feels awful. I was so overwrought because I had done something nice, but I'm going to tell my kid, first thing after school, I'll pick you up at school, and we'll go we have an outlet in a neighboring city, and we'll go and we'll find a pink hoodie. And the kid comes downstairs smiling, wearing the gray hoodie. So it wasn't the hoodie. And what it was, and so we can jump to the conclusion because there's an obvious stress, the stress of the girls making fun of her. But there's an awful lot of stresses that our kids are going through. They're a little bit hypersensitive to sound. They're hypersensitive to, there's more kids when they move into middle school. There's a lot of stresses, physical stresses, and it lowers their threshold for dealing with emotional stress. When they are overstressed. So Dawn gave you the example at the start. Are you hungry? All of those things. If my child is already overstressed, they can't handle this stress of the other girls. We all know what this feels like. There are days when there's nothing I love more than listening to rock music. It reminds me of when I was a kid. I listened to Three Dog Night and but there are times when I am overstressed, when I want to listen to Satie, I want or Bolero, something soothing. And the thought of putting on, so we all know that our internal state determines how much stress I can cope with at any time.
Sure.
Okay, so what we're doing with our children is your kids, because of what they've gone through, your kids are easily overstressed. So we learn to recognize the signs of when they're overstressed. And what we find is the second I do this, the second I say to myself, why now? The second I begin to reframe, my stress comes way down. Instead of having that angry response or that fear response Don described, instead now I become a detective. I know it's a stress behavior. And as I go through this, I become calm. I can go back into the room and my touch will convey through my fingertips that I am calm.
Yeah, that makes such good sense. I want to tell you guys about a new resource from Creating a Family. It's actually not a new resource. We've had it for about 2 years, but I haven't told you about it on the show, and I want to. It is an interactive training support group curriculum for foster, adoptive, and kinship families. We have a library of 23 curriculum on topics that are directly relevant to parenting your children if you are a foster, adoptive, or kinship family. In this, it's a turnkey resource. There's a video, there's a facilitator guide, there's a handout, there's additional resources. You get credit for your continuing education credit if you're a foster parent. It is a terrific resource, and you can find it on our website, creatingafamily.org, under the horizontal menu, Training. Let me pause here and restate we're talking about a 5-step method for managing stress. And we've talked about it for our children, but it's important to think about it for ourselves too.
Yes.
The first step is reframing the behavior by learning the difference between the signs between misbehavior and a stress behavior. That's the why and why now. The second one is recognizing the stressors. There's the typical stressors that are easy to see, but there are also some hidden stressors that we've talked about that either we don't see because they're happening not in front of us, or the response is delayed. The third step is looking for ways to reduce stress. And we've talked about some, but I'll throw out a few others. But we talked about the bath, we talked about touch, but deep breathing is a great one. And there's
huge.
The technique there's a technique that we can use with children. I like it's the pizza breath. You put your hands out as if you're reaching for a piece of pizza, and it's in your hands, and you bring it to your nose, and you smell deeply. And then that pizza's hot, so you're blowing out. You purse your lips and you blow out to cool the pizza off. And kids love that. It's a fun thing. Exercise, you've mentioned. Touch, you mentioned. Music, and another one, if you have pets, the cuddling with a pet, or throwing a ball with the pet, or stroking a pet. And there's so many others. So that's the third step, looking for ways, and it would be specific to your child. Because you mentioned some children would rather be scratched than rubbed or massaged or whatever. They're just different forms of touch. And then the fourth one is reflect on what it feels like to be calm. We want our kids to recognize the feeling of calmness, because they may not. Yeah. And honestly, we may not. So we need to recognize in ourselves that when I'm getting revved up, I can feel that. But when I'm calming down, I need to feel that. And you mentioned the dolls, which is a great one. The spaghetti I happen to love. But you can also just act out the difference, scratch out your face and your arms, and then just kind of act like a rag doll. Yeah. So the fifth one, what would be the fifth and the final of these 5 steps?
Last step is restoration. So restoration means you're restoring energy, you're restoring balance, you're restoring a connection with your parents, You're restoring your positive mood. What we find with our kids is they only partially restore. So you can go to sleep. Look, all of us can do this. We can go to sleep thinking, I'll get a good 8 hours and I'll be restored. And you wake up in the morning and you're not. You
Yeah.
didn't have that calm, restorative sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Our kids have a lot of trouble fully restoring. And so what we have to do is we have to plan these activities. So I would do things like I love the one with the pets. I have a chicken farm. And when my younger boy got upset, we always knew where he'd be. He'd be in the chicken coop holding one of the chickens and stroking the chicken.
Interesting. Yeah, I never think of chickens as enjoying that, but I guess whether they enjoyed it or not, it worked for him.
So, but the reason I mentioned it is we had a very interesting way of helping them to restore. It would have to be a day, usually on the weekend, with nothing. And what we're going to do is we spend the day doing chores. And one of the most restorative things I could do with my kids, believe it or not, was cleaning out the chicken coop. I had to make it fun. I had to be there with them. I had to clean the damn coop. But bear in mind that, and I read the news about your country, and you guys are having a lot of trouble restoring these days.
True that.
If we are only partially restored, we are much more susceptible to having a stress response. So we're going to learn what the signs of full restoration are and how we're going to do it.
Okay, so what are I'm so appreciative that you also, not just energy and balance, but you talked about relationship, restoring the relationship.
Yes.
When the daughter in the story you gave said, "I love you, Mommy."
Exactly.
She was restoring the relationship. With my kids, sometimes something that if things were just falling apart and we were in the car, sometimes, and after there had been time, I had music going to help us all calm down. I could reach my hand back in the back seat and just rest it on their leg.
Love it. I just love it.
And very often my child would then, or one of my children would then reach out and just touch my hand. And that we were saying without words, okay, the bad thing was over. And then honestly, usually it was over at that point. We were just, I forgive you, you forgive me. It was just a touch.
You got to come work with us. That's just perfect.
So we were talking about restoration. How do you know?
You know what? Parents can tell in their voice. You can tell just by the sound of their voice. You can tell by the look on their face, by the color of their skin. But there's a real simple one. And that is, does your kid come down in the morning and smile? Mm-hmm. You know right away, right?
Yeah, it's a good one.
That we haven't restored. And so we're gonna do something a little different today. We're gonna break the mold, whatever it is. I've got to get my kid to restore. And when they restore, what happens is there's a neat little brain mechanism that I talk a lot about in the last book. It gets into balance, and it is like a furnace that you set at 70 degrees, and it stays at that temperature. Our kids, they're going down to 60, up to 80, and so when they are restored, it sticks at 70, and we get all the signs from them. So, what's going to restore your kid? Well, every kid is different. So for my younger boy, it was soccer. For my older boy, it was hockey. Everyone has to discover what brings those smiles. And that's what's telling me when the furnace is operating properly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. With one of mine who had a hair, she would go from 0 to 60 in 1 second. And it would overwhelm me, and it would frustrate me, and it would scare me. And that's a real good one. Yeah, and when we parted, we had not sought restoration at that point. But I would always try, not always do, but I always thought about it or wanted to do it, before the lights were turned out, just to stick my head in and say something like, "I love you," or whatever.
Me too.
And sometimes saying, "I'm sorry for my part of it." I'd have to bite my part of it, just say, "I'm sorry that I responded the way I did. And what I found as she got older is that she was equally, it probably was, by the time she was 18, it was almost 50-50 which one of us would come to the other one's room first, to just say, I love you, and sorry I got so hot, and that type of thing. So there are ways of seeking restoration.
That's just wonderful.
And one of the things you say that I think is so important, you say that these steps we've talked about, reframing the behavior to recognize that it's not misbehavior. This is not a bad kid. This is a kid, stress kid. Recognizing the stressors, including the hidden stressors, teaching your child and yourself ways to reduce the stress, teaching your child what it feels like to be calm, and then the fifth one, seeking restoration. These steps are not a program as much for managing a child's behavior, but for understanding a child's behavior. And I think that's key. I think that understanding that, the child's behavior may improve, but it's because you're understanding their behavior that's helping the improvement.
Seriously, that's, in one sentence, you just summed up everything. Oh, my life's work.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stuart Shanker.
Thanks,
I highly recommend your books, and I am thankful that you were here for us today and shared your wisdom. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Keep up the great work.